The sledgehammer crashed through hundred-year-old timber as Margaret Chen watched her grandfather's bridge, the last piece of him she had left, crumble into Clearwater Lake. The HOA president smiled smugly from his boat, not knowing that beneath those dark waters lay the key to his million-dollar empire. What he'd just destroyed wasn't just a bridge. It was the dam that kept his precious lakefront resort from becoming a muddy wasteland. And Margaret, she was the only one who knew how to close the floodgates forever. The morning sun cast golden ripples across Clearwater Lake as Margaret Chen stood on her grandfather's wooden bridge, running her fingers along the weathered handrail he'd carved by hand 60 years ago. The wood was smooth from decades of use, each grain telling a story of summer evenings when Grandpa Joe would teach her to fish from this very spot. "Every board I cut myself," she could still hear his gravelly voice saying. "Every nail I drove. With these hands, this bridge ain't going nowhere, Maggie. It'll outlast us all." Margaret smiled sadly, adjusting her grip on the steaming coffee mug. At 34, she'd inherited more than just the lakefront cabin and the 20 acres surrounding it. She'd inherited the memories, the responsibility, and apparently the enemies. The rumble of boat engines shattered the morning tranquility. Margaret looked up to see a flotilla of vessels cutting through the water toward her, 5 boats flying official Clearwater Lake Homeowners Association flags, their chrome gleaming like weapons in the sunlight. The lead boat belonged to Richard Blackwood, HOA president and owner of the Clearwater Resort and Spa, the sprawling luxury complex that dominated the lake's eastern shore. His perfectly coiffed silver hair remained unmoved by the wind as he stood at the bow like some conquering admiral. Margaret's stomach tightened. She'd been dreading this moment for months. Blackwood's boat pulled up to the dock beside her bridge, followed by the others carrying HOA board members, a county inspector, and what looked like a demolition crew. The morning's peace evaporated as engines cut and voices rose. "Miss Chen!" Blackwood's voice boomed across the water as he stepped onto her dock without invitation. "I trust you received our final notice." Margaret descended from the bridge, her bare feet silent on the dock planks. "I received a lot of papers from you, Mr. Blackwood. Most of them illegible legal garbage." "The county has ruled," Blackwood said, pulling out an official document. "This structure is in violation of waterway regulations. It blocks navigational access to the northern cove and creates a hazard for watercraft." "Hazard?" Margaret's voice cracked with disbelief. "This bridge has been here since 1963. Your resort's been open for 3 years. Who's the real hazard?" Blackwood's smile was razor-thin. "The law is the law, Ms. Chen. The bridge must come down today or we'll have it removed by court order." Margaret looked past him at the demolition crew unloading equipment. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "You can't just destroy someone's property because it inconveniences your business." "We're not destroying it," said Councilman Phillips, stepping forward with his tablet. "We're removing a code violation. The bridge extends 30 feet beyond your property line into public waterway. That makes it illegal." "That's impossible," Margaret shot back. "My grandfather had this surveyed when he built it." 60 years ago, Phillips replied smoothly. "Property lines change, lake levels change, laws change." Margaret felt the trap closing around her. She'd spent her life savings on legal fees fighting this, only to watch her lawyers get buried under an avalanche of HOA motions, county citations, and environmental impact studies. Blackwood had connections, money, and time. She had stubborn pride and a bridge that meant everything to her. "Please," she said, hating the desperation in her voice, "give me 30 days. I'll hire a surveyor, prove the bridge is legal." "No more delays," Blackwood cut her off. "You've had 6 months to comply." He gestured to the crew. "Gentlemen, proceed." Margaret watched in horror as the workers wheeled chainsaws and sledgehammers onto her dock. The noise was deafening. Engines roaring to life, metal clanging. Boots stomping across the planks her grandfather had laid with such care. "Stop!" she screamed, but her voice was lost in the chaos. The first chainsaw bit into the bridge's support beam with a mechanical shriek. Wood chips flew like snow as 60 years of weathering and memories were reduced to sawdust. Margaret felt each cut like a physical blow. "You have to understand," Blackwood appeared beside her, speaking in her ear like a snake. "This isn't personal, it's progress. The Northern Cove will soon house our new luxury yacht club. Your little bridge would have blocked access for our members' vessels." Margaret turned to face him, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You're destroying the last thing I have of him. I'm creating jobs, investment, growth." Blackwood's eyes were cold as winter lake water. "Your sentiment doesn't trump economic development." A thunderous crack echoed across the water as the bridge's main support gave way. The entire structure tilted drunkenly before crashing into the lake with a splash that sent waves racing in every direction. Fish scattered in silver flashes beneath the foam. Margaret sank to her knees on the dock, watching pieces of hand-carved railing float away like coffin flowers. The workers cheered, already packing their equipment. In 20 minutes, they'd erased 6 decades of craftsmanship and love. "Clean up your debris by weekend," Blackwood called over his shoulder as he headed back to his boat. "Or we'll add removal costs to your HOA fine." "I'm not a member of your HOA," Margaret said weakly. "You are now," Phillips replied, waving another document. "County reclassification. Your property's been rezoned into our jurisdiction. Welcome to the neighborhood." Margaret watched the boats disappear around the bend toward Blackwood's resort, their wakes lapping against the dock where her bridge used to stand. She sat in stunned silence for nearly an hour, watching the floating debris slowly disperse. Finally, she stood and walked to her cabin, stepping over the scattered legal notices that had blown across her yard. Inside, she pulled out the cardboard box she'd been avoiding for months, the one containing her grandfather's papers. Most of it was routine: old insurance policies, faded receipts, property deeds. But at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, was something that made her heart skip. A hand-drawn engineering diagram titled Clearwater Lake Emergency Drainage System, 1962. Margaret spread the yellowed paper across her kitchen table, studying her grandfather's meticulous pencil work. Joe Chen hadn't just been a carpenter and fisherman. He'd been a civil engineer for the county before his retirement, and he'd designed the lake's flood control system. Her finger traced the network of channels, spillways, and control gates that regulated water flow from Clearwater Lake to the Broken Creek downstream. Most of it was automated now, controlled by computers at the County Water Authority. But there was one manual override, a series of gates built into the lake's natural dam that could be operated by hand. Margaret's pulse quickened as she read. Her grandfather's notes in the margins: emergency drain protocol, manual gate sequence for rapid lake lowering in event of dam failure or contamination. Approximate drainage time for full lake, 72 to 96 hours depending on downstream capacity. She looked up from the plans, staring out her window toward the lake where Blackwood's resort sprawled across the eastern shore. The Clearwater Resort and Spa, with its waterfront restaurants, boat docks, luxury suites, and private beaches, all of it built at water level, depending entirely on the lake staying exactly where it was. Margaret's grief began transforming into something harder, sharper. She thought about the bridge sinking beneath the waves, about Blackwood's smug smile, about 60 years of memories reduced to floating splinters. Then she looked back at the diagram, following the drainage system from the manual gates to the spillway channels that would carry Clearwater Lake away, leaving behind nothing but mud flats and the skeletal remains of docks reaching toward empty air. Her grandfather's voice seemed to whisper from the yellowed paper. "Every engineer knows that water always finds a way, Maggie. You just have to know where to point it." Margaret folded the diagram carefully and slipped it into her jacket pocket. She walked outside to her truck, started the engine, and drove toward the old access road that led to the lake's dam structure, a route she hadn't traveled since she was a child, when Grandpa Joe would take her on his weekend inspections. As she drove, she pulled out her phone and called her insurance company. "Hi, this is Margaret Chen. I need to increase my homeowner's policy coverage immediately." "Yes, I'll hold." The trees closed in around her truck as she followed the forgotten road deeper into the forest, toward the concrete structures that held back millions of gallons of mountain water. In her rearview mirror, she could see Blackwood's resort gleaming in the distance across the lake, completely unaware of the storm that was coming. The old access road hadn't been maintained in decades. Margaret's truck bounced through potholes and scraped against overgrown branches as she navigated the winding path toward the lake's dam structure. Her grandfather's diagram lay spread across the passenger seat, weighted down by her thermos to keep the brittle paper from tearing. After 20 minutes of bone-jarring driving, she emerged into a clearing where concrete and steel infrastructure jutted from the hillside like ancient monuments. The primary dam stretched across the natural outlet where Clearwater Lake fed into Broken Creek, but it was the smaller structures that interested her. The emergency spillways and manual control stations her grandfather had designed as fail-safes. Margaret parked beside a rusted chain-link fence and grabbed her bolt cutters from the truck bed. The "Authorized Personnel Only" sign was so faded she could barely read it. She snipped the padlock and pushed through the gate. The manual control station was housed in a concrete bunker built into the hillside, camouflaged by 60 years of moss and vine growth. Margaret found the heavy steel door and tried the handle. Locked, but the metal had corroded enough that a few kicks near the latch sent it swinging open with a screech of protest. Inside, emergency lighting flickered to life, revealing banks of gauges, valve wheels, and mechanical switches that looked like something from a submarine. Everything was labeled in her grandfather's careful handwriting: primary flow, emergency, bypass. Spillway gates 1 to 6. Margaret pulled out the diagram and compared it to the actual controls. Her grandfather's engineering was elegant in its simplicity. 6 massive gates could be opened in sequence to drain the lake through natural spillway channels that would carry the water safely downstream without flooding. The system was designed to empty Clearwater Lake in an emergency, then allow it to refill naturally from mountain streams. She tested the first valve wheel. It turned grudgingly, metal grinding against metal, but it moved. The gauge needle crept upward, indicating Gate 1 was responding. She quickly closed it again and moved to the next station. All 6 gates were functional. Margaret stood in the humming control room, studying the master gauge that showed Clearwater Lake's current water level. The needle pointed to full, indicating millions of gallons held back by concrete, steel, and her grandfather's engineering. Genius! Her phone buzzed. A text from her insurance agent. "Policy increase approved. Additional coverage effective immediately. Janet." Margaret smiled grimly and pocketed the phone. She'd just increased her homeowner's coverage by 300%, citing environmental concerns and potential property damage from HOA construction activities. It would cost her a fortune in premiums, but it would also establish a paper trail showing she'd anticipated problems. The drive back to her cabin took longer as she memorized landmarks and timing. 37 minutes from her front door to the control station. She'd need to remember that. Back home, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with her laptop, researching everything she could find about Richard Blackwood and his resort empire. What she discovered made her blood boil even hotter. Blackwood owned 17 luxury properties across 3 states, all built around natural water features. His business model was simple: identify pristine lakes, rivers, or coastlines, then systematically acquire or force out longtime residents to build exclusive resorts. The Clearwater project was just his latest conquest. According to county records, Blackwood had purchased 500 acres of lakeshore property 3 years ago for a fraction of its current value, from families who'd been driven out by sudden HOA fee increases, code violations, and legal harassment. The same tactics he was using on her now. Margaret found a local news article from 2 years ago. Longtime Clearwater residents forced to sell family properties. The story featured the Hendersons, whose family had owned lake property for 4 generations before HOA fines and legal fees bankrupted them. Their quote made Margaret's hands shake with rage. "We begged them to work with us, but they wanted us gone. They destroyed our dock, claimed our septic system was illegal, and sued us into poverty. Richard Blackwood doesn't build resorts. He builds them on the bones of families like ours." Margaret scrolled through more articles, finding a pattern of environmental violations at Blackwood's other properties. Contaminated runoff, damaged wetlands, and mysterious fish kills that always seemed to happen after his construction projects. But somehow, his legal team always managed to pin the blame on neighboring properties or claim the damage was pre-existing. Her laptop chimed with an email notification. The sender made her stomach drop. "Clearwater Lake HOA. Final notice. Ms. Chen, your property has been assessed the following fees and fines. Bridge debris removal, $2,047. Emergency demolition costs, $4,220. HOA. Initiation fee, retroactive. $1,500. Monthly dues, 12 months retroactive. $3,600. Code violation penalties, $5,200 total amount. Due, $17,367. Payment is due within 30 days, or we will initiate foreclosure proceedings and place a lien on your property. Regards, Clearwater Lake, HOA Board." Margaret stared at the screen in disbelief. They were trying to steal her property the same way they'd stolen the others, by burying her under impossible fees and legal costs until she had no choice but to sell. She looked out her window toward the lake, where Blackwood's resort glittered in the afternoon sun. Guests lounged on private beaches, boats cruised between the docks, and the waterfront restaurants were packed with diners paying premium prices for their pristine natural setting. Margaret opened a new browser tab and began researching property values around drained lakes. What she found was devastating. When Lake Meredith in Texas had been drained for dam repairs, waterfront property values had plummeted by 80%. Businesses had closed, tourism had evaporated, and the local economy had crashed. But unlike Lake Meredith, Clearwater's drainage would look like a natural disaster. No one would know the lake could be refilled until it was too late. Her phone rang. The caller ID showed her lawyer, David Kim. "Margaret, I got some bad news about the HOA situation." David's voice was grim. "They filed 3 more motions today. They're claiming your property is environmentally hazardous because of bridge debris, and they want emergency authority to seize it for cleanup." "Can they do that?" "With the right judge, yeah. Blackwood's got connections all through the county government. His resort brings in too much tax revenue for them to ignore." Margaret felt the walls closing in. "How long do I have?" "Maybe a week before they get a hearing. 2 at most." "Margaret, I hate to say this, but you might want to consider settling. Take whatever they're offering and walk away while you still can." After David hung up, Margaret sat in her kitchen staring at her grandfather's photograph on the mantel. Joe Chen in his army uniform, fresh back from Korea, holding the deed to 20 acres of untouched wilderness on Clearwater Lake. He'd built everything with his own hands, the cabin, the dock, the bridge, creating a legacy he'd planned to pass down through generations. "I won't let them win, Grandpa," she whispered. Margaret walked to her bedroom closet and pulled out a waterproof duffel bag. She packed changes of clothes, non-perishable food, camping gear, and every battery-powered device she owned. Then she loaded her grandfather's tools into the truck, wrenches, hydraulic jacks, and the heavy-duty cable cutters he'd used for electrical work. As the sun set over Clearwater Lake, Margaret made one final phone call to her sister in Portland. "Sarah, it's me. I need you to do something and I can't explain why." "Maggie, you sound strange. What's wrong?" "In exactly 4 days, call the county sheriff and tell them you're worried about me. Say you haven't heard from me and ask them to check on my cabin. Can you do that?" 4 days? Margaret, what are you planning?" "I'm planning to save Grandpa's land. And Sarah, no matter what you hear on the news, remember that I love you." Margaret hung up before her sister could respond. She grabbed the duffel bag and drove back to the dam control station, this time parking her truck in the woods where it couldn't be seen from the access road. Inside the bunker, she set up a makeshift camp with her sleeping bag and supplies. She had everything she needed to survive for a week, which should be more than enough time. Margaret pulled out her grandfather's diagram one final time, tracing the water flow patterns with her finger. When she opened all 6 gates simultaneously, Clearwater Lake would drain through the spillway channels at maximum flow rate. According to the calculations, the lake level would drop 2 feet in the first hour, 5 feet by the end of day 1, and completely empty within 72 hours. Blackwoods Resort, built at current water level, would be left high and dry like a beached whale. Margaret set her alarm for 3 a.m. and tried to get some sleep on the concrete floor of the bunker. Tomorrow would begin the most important 3 days of her life. At exactly 3:17 a.m., she woke to the sound of trucks rumbling past on the main road below. Construction crews heading to another early morning demolition job at someone else's family property. Margaret stood up, walked to the control panel, and placed her hand on the first valve wheel. "This is for you, Grandpa," she whispered, and began to turn. The first valve wheel fought against 60 years of rust and mineral deposits, but Margaret's grandfather had built his mechanisms to last. Metal groaned against metal as she threw her full weight into turning the massive wheel. When it finally gave way, the sound that followed was unlike anything she'd ever heard. A deep hydraulic rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. Margaret moved to the second station, her heart hammering as she felt the bunker's concrete floor vibrate beneath her feet. Outside, millions of gallons of water were beginning their journey through spillway channels carved into the mountainside, following paths her grandfather had designed to carry the lake away safely. Gate 2 opened easier, as if the system was waking up after decades of sleep. By the time she'd opened all 6 gates, the sound was deafening, a constant roar of rushing water that echoed through the concrete bunker like standing inside a waterfall. Margaret checked her watch. 3:47 a.m. The lake was draining at maximum flow rate. She pulled out her grandfather's diagram and did the math again. At full drainage capacity, Clearwater Lake would drop approximately 18 inches every hour. Blackwoods Resort docks would be sitting on mudflats by sunset. Margaret settled into her sleeping bag to wait, but sleep was impossible. The sound of rushing water filled her dreams, mixing with memories of her grandfather's voice. "Water always finds a way, Maggie." At dawn, she climbed to the bunker's observation window and looked out over the lake. The change was already visible. Boat docks that had been floating level with the shore were now angled downward, their metal supports exposed like broken bones. The lake's surface had dropped nearly 4 feet overnight. Her phone showed 17 missed calls from unknown numbers. Margaret ignored them and climbed back down to check the control systems. All 6 gates were functioning perfectly, their gauges showing maximum flow through the spillway channels. By noon, the first emergency vehicles appeared. Margaret watched from her hidden vantage point as fire trucks and paramedic units raced along the lakeshore road. Through her grandfather's binoculars, she could see crowds gathering at Blackwoods Resort, pointing at docks that now hung suspended over expanding mudflats. The lake level had dropped 8 feet. Boat motors were running aground in water that had been deep enough to navigate just hours before. The resort's waterfront restaurants were still serving lunch, but their scenic lake view windows now looked out on increasingly barren shoreline. Margaret's phone rang. She recognized the number, David Kim, her lawyer. "Margaret, where are you? The county's issued an emergency evacuation order for all lake residents. They think there's been a catastrophic dam failure." "I'm safe," Margaret said calmly. "Safe where? The lake's draining like someone pulled a plug. Environmental teams are saying it's unprecedented. They've never seen water levels drop this fast without a major structural collapse." Margaret watched another boat run aground, its captain frantically reversing engines. "Maybe it's just a really dry year." "Margaret, this isn't a joke. If you're anywhere near the lake, you need to evacuate now. They don't know if more of the dam might give way." She hung up and continued watching through the binoculars. County engineers were arriving in trucks, unloading equipment and spreading maps across the hoods of their vehicles. It would take them hours to locate all the spillway outlets, and even longer to trace the water flow back to the manual control station. By afternoon, the situation at Blackwood's resort had become desperate. Margaret could see staff members attempting to extend dock pilings with construction equipment, trying to keep their boat slips functional as the water receded. The resort's private beach was now a 50-yard stretch of exposed lake bottom, scattered with confused fish and decades of accumulated debris. The waterfront restaurants had closed when their lakeside decks became unusable, and the resort's famous sunset cruise had been canceled when their tour boat couldn't reach deep enough water to operate. Margaret estimated she'd cost Blackwood at least $100,000 in lost revenue already, and the lake was only half empty. Her phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed Blackwood Richard. Margaret stared at the screen for 3 rings before answering. "Ms. Chen." Blackwood's voice was tight with barely controlled fury. "I know this is you." "I don't know what you mean, Mr. Blackwood. The lake doesn't just drain itself. Someone opened those spillway gates, and you're the only person with both motive and access to your grandfather's engineering plans." Margaret watched through the binoculars as Blackwood paced on his resort's empty boat dock, phone pressed to his ear. "That's quite an accusation. I'm sure the county engineers will figure out what happened. You're destroying a multi-million-dollar investment. Do you have any idea how many jobs this resort provides? How much tax revenue?" "About as much as you cared when you destroyed my bridge." Blackwood's voice dropped to a whisper. "Listen carefully. I will bury you. I'll have you arrested for vandalism, terrorism, destruction of public property. I'll sue you for every penny you've ever earned and every penny you'll ever make. You'll do what, exactly?" Margaret interrupted. "Sue the woman whose property you stole? The granddaughter of the man who built the system that's currently draining your precious lake?" "This isn't over." "You're right. It's not." Margaret hung up and checked her watch. The lake had been draining for 14 hours. At the current rate, it would be completely empty by tomorrow evening. As the sun set over the rapidly shrinking lake, Margaret climbed back to the observation window for the evening show. Blackwood's resort looked like a disaster zone. Boats sat stranded in mud, their hulls tilted at impossible angles. The waterfront walking paths now led to nothing but exposed lake bottom stretching into the distance. Emergency lighting had been set up around the resort as staff worked desperately to salvage what they could. Margaret watched them using forklifts to move furniture and equipment from the ground floor restaurants before the building's foundation became unstable. The really expensive boats, the 50-foot cabin cruisers and luxury yachts, were still afloat in the deepest part of the lake, but they'd be sitting on mud by morning. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from her sister, Sarah. "Margaret, the news is showing Clearwater Lake draining. Are you okay? Please call me." She typed back, "I'm fine, don't worry. Everything will be okay soon." Around midnight, Margaret heard helicopters overhead, news crews documenting what they were calling the fastest natural drainage event in recorded history. Their searchlights swept across the exposed lake bottom, revealing decades of sunken, debris, old car frames, and the skeletal remains of structures that had been underwater since the original dam was built. Margaret made herself a cup of instant coffee and settled in for the night. Through the bunker's ventilation system, she could hear the constant roar of water rushing through the spillway channels, carrying away Blackwood's empire 1 gallon at a time. At 3 a.m., exactly 24 hours after she'd opened the first gate, her phone rang again. The caller ID showed County Sheriff. "This is Sheriff Martinez. Am I speaking with Margaret Chen?" "Yes, sir." "Ms. Chen, we have teams searching for you. Your sister reported you missing, and we're concerned for your safety given the emergency situation at the lake." "I'm safe, Sheriff. I'm staying with friends until the situation stabilizes." "Good. Good. Ms. Chen, I need to ask you something, and I want you to know this conversation is being recorded. Do you have any knowledge of how the lake's drainage system was activated?" Margaret looked around the bunker at the open valve wheels, the humming gauges, the master control panel that showed water rushing out of Clearwater Lake at maximum flow rate. "Sheriff, I'm just a carpenter. I wouldn't know the first thing about hydraulic engineering." "Your grandfather designed the original drainage system." "That was 60 years ago. I was in diapers." There was a long pause. "Ms. Chen, if you know anything about this situation, now would be the time to come forward. We're treating this as a possible act of sabotage." "I understand your concern, Sheriff. But like I said, I'm no engineer." After Martinez hung up, Margaret walked to the control panel and checked the flow gauges. The system was working perfectly, just as her grandfather had designed it. Every safety mechanism was functioning, every spillway channel was carrying water safely downstream without flooding. The only thing failing was Richard Blackwood's ability to profit from stolen land. Margaret curled up in her sleeping bag and tried to rest. Tomorrow would bring the final act, the moment when Clearwater Lake reached its minimum level and Blackwood's resort sat completely high and dry, surrounded by acres of exposed mud flats. She dreamed of her grandfather standing on his handmade bridge, smiling as he watched the water flow exactly where he'd planned it to go. For the first time in 36 hours, the bunker wasn't filled with the roar of rushing water. She checked the flow gauges. All 6 spillway channels were still open, but the pressure readings had dropped to near zero. Clearwater Lake had reached minimum drainage level. It was 6:47 a.m. on the 3rd day. Margaret climbed to the observation window and gasped. Where Clearwater Lake had sparkled just 2 days ago, a vast expanse of cracked mud stretched to the horizon. The exposed lake bottom looked like an alien landscape, scattered with the ghostly remains of sunken boats, rusted car frames, and the concrete foundations of structures that had been underwater for decades. Blackwood's resort sat marooned in the center of it all like a beached cruise ship. The luxury complex that had once commanded panoramic water views now overlooked a muddy wasteland dotted with the skeletal remains of boat docks reaching toward nothing. Margaret packed her gear methodically. Phase 1 was complete. Blackwood's empire was literally high and dry. Now came the dangerous part. Her phone showed 43 missed calls and dozens of text messages. The story had gone national. CNN was calling it the Great Drain, the fastest recorded emptying of a natural lake in U.S. history. Environmental groups were demanding investigations. Tourism officials were calculating economic losses in the millions. Margaret drove back to her cabin, taking the long way around to avoid the checkpoint the sheriff's department had set up on the main lake road. Her property looked strange, without the familiar sight of water lapping at her dock. The extended pier now jutted out over dry land like a wooden bridge to nowhere. Inside her cabin, Margaret showered and changed into clean clothes, then sat down to wait. According to her plan, Sarah would call the sheriff in exactly 1 hour to report her missing. That would give Margaret the perfect alibi. She'd been unreachable during the lake drainage because she'd been lost or injured, not because she'd been operating heavy machinery in a hidden bunker. At 8:15 a.m., her doorbell rang. Margaret opened the door to find Richard Blackwood flanked by two men in expensive suits. His usually perfect appearance was disheveled, wrinkled shirt, unshaven face, wild eyes that spoke of sleepless nights watching his empire crumble. "Ms. Chen," Blackwood's voice was raw. "We need to talk." "I'm sorry for your losses, Mr. Blackwood. I heard about the lake on the news. Terrible tragedy. Cut the act." He pushed past her into the cabin, his associates following. "We know you did this." Margaret closed the door calmly. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave my property." "Your property?" Blackwood laughed bitterly. "You mean the property you're about to lose to HOA liens? The property that'll be worthless now that there's no lake?" One of the suits spoke up, a thin man with dead eyes. "Ms. Chen, I'm Marcus Webb, Mr. Blackwood's head of security. We've done some research into your background." "How nice for you." "Did you know your grandfather kept detailed journals? We found them in the county archives. Very interesting reading. Turns out Joe Chen was quite the meticulous record keeper." Margaret's blood ran cold, but she kept her expression neutral. Webb continued. "June 15th, 1963. Completed manual override installation for emergency drainage system. 6 gates, full lake drainage in 72-96 hours. Ring any bells? My grandfather was an engineer. Engineers keep records." Blackwood stepped closer, his face inches from hers. "Where are the controls, Margaret? Where are the goddamn gates? I have no idea what you're talking about." "Bullshit!" Blackwood exploded, slamming his fist against her kitchen table. "My resort is sitting in a mud pit. I've got 200 guests demanding refunds, a staff of 60 people out of work, and $15 million in property that's now worthless. You did this." Margaret looked at the three men crowding her kitchen. Blackwood's rage, Webb's cold calculation, and the third man's hand resting obviously on something concealed under his jacket. "Even if I somehow had the ability to drain a lake," she said quietly, "why would I care? You destroyed the last thing I had left of my grandfather. You've spent months trying to steal my property. You've bankrupted families and ruined lives to build your little empire. Maybe what happened to your resort is just karma." Webb pulled out a tablet and showed her a satellite image. "This is what the lake bottom looks like from above. See those 6 dark lines? Those are drainage channels. We've traced them back to a concrete structure about 2 miles from here." Margaret's heart hammered, but she shrugged. "Looks like some kind of old infrastructure. Maybe you should call the county engineers." "We did," Blackwood said. "They're sending a team this afternoon." "But here's the thing, Margaret. When they find those controls and when they find your fingerprints all over them, you're going to prison for a very long time." The third man finally spoke, his voice carrying a slight accent. "Destruction of public property, environmental terrorism, sabotage of critical infrastructure, 25 to life, minimum." Margaret looked at each of them in turn. "Are you threatening me?" "We're offering you a choice," Webb said smoothly. "Tell us how to refill the lake and we'll make this go away. Refuse, and we'll make sure you spend the rest of your life in a federal prison." "And how exactly would you make it go away?" "The county engineers are already investigating." Blackwood smiled for the first time since entering her cabin. "Money. Talk, sweetheart. I've got senators on speed dial and judges who owe me favors. One phone call from me and the investigation gets redirected toward natural causes. Maybe an earthquake shifted the underground channels. Maybe climate change affected the water table. Point is, if you cooperate, this becomes a natural disaster instead of a federal crime." Margaret walked to her kitchen window and looked out at the empty lake bed. In the distance, she could see news helicopters circling like vultures, documenting the environmental catastrophe that had once been Clearwater Lake. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Close the drainage gates, Webb said. Let the lake refill naturally. It'll take a few months, but my boss can weather that timeline if he knows the water's coming back. And in exchange? We forget. This conversation ever happened. The HOA liens disappear. You keep your property. Blackwood's voice turned wheedling. Hell, I'll even pay you a consulting fee for your geological expertise in helping us understand what happened. Margaret turned back to face them. How much? 50,000, cash. That's insulting. Blackwood's eye twitched. How much do you want? I want my grandfather's bridge rebuilt, exactly as it was, using the original materials you scattered across the lake bottom. I want a written apology from the HOA board for the harassment. And I want a conservation easement on my property that prevents any future development or interference. Done. Blackwood pulled out his phone. I can have the paperwork drawn up in an hour. Margaret nodded slowly. All right, let me get my truck keys. She walked toward her bedroom, then stopped. Oh, and gentlemen, before we go, there's something you should know about my grandfather's engineering. What's that? Webb asked. Margaret smiled, pulling her phone from her pocket. He didn't just design the drainage system, he designed the safety locks too. She held up her phone screen, showing a text message she'd sent to herself 3 hours ago. Emergency protocol activated. Auto refill sequence initiated. Gate closure in 3 hours unless manual override entered. Webb grabbed the phone, his face going pale as he read the timestamp. What does that mean? Blackwood demanded. Margaret's smile widened. It means those drainage gates are going to slam shut automatically in exactly 47 minutes. When they do, they'll lock into position with explosive bolts that can only be reset by trained county engineers. The lake will start refilling immediately, but it'll take 6 months to reach normal levels. You're lying. Check the county engineering archives. My grandfather was paranoid about sabotage during the Cold War. He built automated fail-safes into everything. Margaret looked directly at Blackwood. Unless, of course, someone enters the correct override code at the manual control station before the timer runs out. The three men exchanged panicked glances. What's the code? Webb snapped. Margaret picked up her truck keys. I guess we'd better hurry. Traffic to the dam access road can be murder this time of day. As they rushed toward the door, Margaret caught sight of her grandfather's photograph on the mantel. Joe Chen was smiling in his army uniform, holding the deed to 20 acres of wilderness that would stay in the family for generations. Don't worry, Grandpa, she whispered. These idiots have no idea what they're walking into. The ride to the dam access road was tense with desperate energy. Blackwood drove his Mercedes like a maniac, taking curves at dangerous speeds, while Webb barked directions from the passenger seat. Margaret sat calmly in the back beside the silent enforcer, watching the clock on her phone count down. 31 minutes until her fictional automated failsafe triggered. This road is a nightmare, Blackwood cursed as they hit another pothole. How the hell did you even find this place? My grandfather used to bring me here when I was little, Margaret said truthfully. He'd check on his systems every few months. Webb twisted around to study her face. You're awfully calm for someone about to commit federal crimes. Margaret shrugged. I'm not committing anything. I'm helping you fix a natural disaster, remember? That's your story, isn't it? 28 minutes. The Mercedes scraped bottom as they navigated the winding forest road. Through the trees, Margaret could see news helicopters still circling the empty lake bed, their cameras documenting what CNN was calling an environmental catastrophe of unprecedented scale. There, Margaret pointed to the rusted chain link fence she'd cut 3 days ago. The control station is through those trees. Blackwood parked, and they hiked through the underbrush toward the concrete bunker. Margaret led the way, her heart pounding with anticipation. Everything depended on the next few minutes. Jesus Christ, Webb breathed when they reached the bunker. This thing's like a Cold War missile silo. Margaret pushed open the heavy steel door she'd left unlocked. The three men followed her into the humming control room, their eyes widening as they took in the banks of gauges, valve wheels, and monitoring equipment. "My God," Blackwood whispered. "It's all here. Every control. For the entire lake system." Margaret checked her phone. 23 minutes. "The override console is over there." She pointed to a panel covered in switches and digital readouts. "But I need to warn you, if we don't enter the code sequence correctly, the whole system locks down permanently. The county would have to blast the spillway gates to get them closed." "What's the code?" Webb demanded. Margaret walked to the master control panel, her finger hovering over a series of switches. "My grandfather was old-fashioned. He used his Army service number." She began flipping switches in a seemingly random sequence, watching the men's faces as gauges flickered and warning lights blinked on across the control room. "Is it working?" Blackwood asked anxiously. "Almost there." Margaret flipped 3 more switches, then paused dramatically at the final control. "You know, before I do this, I want to make sure we understand each other." "What do you mean?" Webb's voice was sharp with suspicion. Margaret turned to face them, her hand still poised over the final switch. "I mean, I want your word that this ends here. No more harassment, no more legal threats, no more attempts to steal my property." "You have my word," Blackwood said quickly. "And the families you've already destroyed, the Hendersons, the Yamadas, all the others you forced out?" Blackwood's face darkened. "Ancient history. We're talking about your situation." Margaret's finger moved toward the switch, then stopped. "Actually, there's something else you should know about my grandfather's system." "What now?" Webb snapped. Margaret smiled and stepped away from the control panel. "There is no automated failsafe." The words hung in the air like a physical blow. Webb's face went white. Blackwood's mouth dropped open. "The drainage gates are manually operated," Margaret continued calmly. "They'll stay open until someone physically closes them, which means your resort is going to sit in that mud pit forever unless you do exactly what I tell you." "You lying bitch!" Blackwood lunged toward her, but the enforcer caught his arm. "Wait," the man said quietly. "Let her talk." Margaret walked to the observation window and gestured toward the empty lake. "Right now, environmental groups are mobilizing. The EPA is launching an investigation. Insurance companies are refusing to pay claims because they're calling this an act of nature. Your resort is worthless, your investors are fleeing, and every day that lake stays empty costs you another $100,000. "What do you want?" Webb asked through gritted teeth. "Justice." Margaret turned back to face them. "For every family you've destroyed, every property you've stolen, every life you've ruined with your corporate greed." She pulled out her phone and showed them a video she'd recorded. On the screen, Blackwood clearly threatened her with federal prosecution and offered bribes to cover up environmental crimes. "This conversation has been live streaming to my sister's computer for the last 20 minutes, Margaret said. "She's already forwarded copies to the FBI, the EPA, and every major news outlet in the state." Blackwood's face turned purple. "You can't prove we did anything illegal?" "Actually, I can." Margaret walked to a filing cabinet built into the bunker wall and pulled out a thick folder. "My grandfather kept meticulous records, including this, the original environmental impact study for your resort." She spread papers across the control panel. "Turns out your construction violated 14 environmental regulations. You built unprotected wetlands, diverted natural water flows, and dumped construction waste directly into the lake. The only reason you got permits was because you bribed county officials." Webb grabbed the papers, his eyes scanning the damning evidence. "Where did you get these?" "My grandfather was the county engineer who wrote the original lake management protocols. He documented every deviation, every violation, every payoff. He kept copies of everything because he knew someday someone would try to destroy this place." Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. FBI received your package. Agents dispatched to your location. Stay safe. The best part, Margaret continued, is that according to federal environmental law, any structure built in violation of wetlands protection can be demolished without compensation to the owner. Blackwood staggered backward as the full implications hit him. You're talking about the entire resort. Every building, every dock, every square foot of illegal construction? Margaret's voice was steel. But here's what's really going to destroy you: the insurance fraud. She pulled out another document. Your resort insurance policy specifically excludes coverage for acts of environmental terrorism or sabotage. But you just spent 20 minutes on live stream admitting that the lake drainage was sabotage, not a natural disaster. Webb went pale. That means your insurance company is going to void every claim related to the drainage. $15 million in property damage, all coming out of your pocket. The sound of helicopters grew louder overhead. Through the bunker's ventilation system, Margaret could hear the distant wail of sirens approaching through the forest. The FBI should be here any minute, Margaret said conversationally. I imagine they'll be very interested in those bribery allegations. Federal corruption charges carry a minimum sentence of 10 years. Blackwood collapsed into a chair, his empire crumbling around him in real time. What do you want from me? Margaret walked to the first valve wheel and placed her hand on it. I want you to personally apologize to every family you've destroyed. I want full financial restitution for their losses. I want your resort demolished and the land restored to its natural state. That's impossible. I'd be bankrupt. You're already bankrupt. You just don't know it yet. Margaret began turning the valve wheel, the sound of rushing water slowly diminishing as Gate 1 started to close. But if you cooperate with the federal investigation, maybe you'll only spend 5 years in prison instead of 20. Webb's phone rang. He answered it, listened for a moment, then hung up with the expression of pure despair. The SEC just froze all company assets pending investigation. The stock price dropped 90% in the last hour. Margaret continued closing gates methodically. With each valve wheel she turned, the roar of draining water grew quieter. By the time she'd closed all 6 gates, the spillway channels had fallen silent. The lake will start refilling within hours, she said. It'll take about 6 months to reach normal levels. Plenty of time for environmental teams to remove your illegal structures and restore the natural habitat. The sound of approaching vehicles grew louder. FBI agents would be here soon, along with EPA investigators, county engineers, and probably half the news media in the state. Margaret walked to her grandfather's photograph, which she'd brought with her and placed on the control panel. Joe Chen smiled back at her from his army uniform, the deed to 20 acres of wilderness visible in his hands. "We did it, Grandpa," she whispered. "The land is safe." Behind her, Richard Blackwood sat broken in his chair while Webb frantically tried to reach lawyers on his phone. The enforcer had already slipped away, probably hoping to disappear before the FBI arrived. Margaret climbed to the observation platform one final time and looked out over the empty lake bed. In a few hours, water would begin flowing back through natural channels, slowly covering the exposed mud and debris. In 6 months, Clearwater Lake would be pristine again, clean, natural, and protected forever by federal environmental regulations. Her phone buzzed with another text from Sarah. "Margaret, you're all over the news. They're calling you the Environmental Avenger. Are you okay?" Margaret typed back, "I'm perfect. Coming home soon." As she packed her grandfather's tools and prepared to meet the Fede.